When you imagine the 1400s, what usually comes to mind? Perhaps Christopher Columbus setting sail, the Renaissance blooming in Europe, or images of monarchs ruling from towering castles. But how often do we think of Africa during that same era? For most people, it's treated as an empty chapter. No cities, no intellectuals, no culture, just silence, as if Africans hadn't yet stepped into history. But what if that silence was deliberately created? Before uncovering what Africans were truly accomplishing in 1490, before the arrival of ships and the beginning of chains, let's take a look at the rest of the world. Starting with the Americas, long before Columbus touched Caribbean shores or Europeans planted their flags, this land was already thriving with rich, ancient civilizations. In Central America, the powerful Aztec Empire rose high under Emperor Ot. Monumental temples pierced the sky, while ritual offerings of human hearts were made to keep the universe in balance. Further south, the Inca Empire stretched from modern Ecuador to Chile, ruling across the soaring Andes through a complex network of storehouses, runners, and irrigation. In the Sacred Valley near Cusco lived the Calisea family. Each dawn, Taika Calisea, mother of four, rose before the first light, preparing maize and potatoes while offering coca leaves to the mountain spirits. Her husband, Yupanqui, returned from maintaining the water canals. Their eldest son, Aini, trained with warriors, while their daughter, Mama Oklo, wove vibrant textiles that told the stories of their people. To them, life was structured, sacred, and harmonious. Yet change was quietly approaching from the east. Across the ocean, Europe was alive with transformation. The Renaissance, an age of rediscovering classical wisdom, was thriving. Artists like Leonardo da Vinci and Sandro Botticelli filled the world with visions of science and beauty. Monarchs plotted, nations battled, and explorers dreamed of finding new routes to Asia. In Spain, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand prepared to send an Italian navigator named Christopher Columbus west in search of spices and gold. Meanwhile, in the peaceful hills of Tuscany, the Duca family lived their own story. Giovanni Duca, a parchment maker, dipped his hands in fresh ink as he copied ancient Latin manuscripts, while his wife, Elena, read aloud passages from Plato's newly translated works. Sophia, their daughter, dreamed of wandering through Florence and Rome, cities alive with debates over knowledge once hidden by centuries. But now, let us turn to a place often excluded from such tales, Africa. Contrary to the silence cast upon it, Africa in the 1490s was vibrant, thriving with kingdoms and empires. In the Sahel, the Songhai Empire commanded great influence. Central Africa flourished under the Kingdom of Congo, and in the dense forests of West Africa stood a fortified city encircled by massive moats and walls that rivaled Europe's finest. This was Benin, modern-day southern Nigeria. Here, the Oba ruled from a grand palace of coral and bronze. Its streets followed carefully designed grids, trade linked it with North Africa, and new connections grew with Portuguese explorers arriving by sea. Benin was no hidden kingdom. Its emissaries negotiated with foreign sailors, its art was exchanged for beads and fabrics, its architecture inspired awe, and its legacy endured. While fleets prepared in Lisbon and great powers clashed across Europe and Asia, Africa, too, was rising. Before diving into the events that followed, the voyages, the meetings, the transformations, let us pause and ask a forgotten question. What were Africans accomplishing in the 1400s? This is where our journey begins, Africa Unveiled. And before we continue, I'd love to hear from you. Where in the world are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. I'll be there engaging with you. If you value this story, a like and subscription would mean so much. Now, let's return to our narrative by setting it in its rightful context. Today, it is widely acknowledged that Christopher Columbus was neither the first to dream of lands across the Atlantic nor the first to cross it. Civilizations like the Vikings, Polynesians, and possibly even the Chinese had charted vast oceans long before him. Yet one possibility still rarely enters mainstream history, that Africans themselves may have sailed across the Atlantic centuries before Columbus ever set out. Both oral histories and medieval accounts point to an astonishing chapter in African exploration, the voyage of Emperor Abu Bakr II, the ninth Musa of the Mali Empire. Around 1311 CE, almost 2 centuries before Columbus, Abu Bakr is believed to have launched an extraordinary expedition across the Atlantic. The fate of this journey remains shrouded in mystery, but the voyage itself was documented. In the 14th century, the Egyptian scholar Shihab al-Amari recorded details after speaking with Mansa Musa, Abu Bakri's successor, during Musa's legendary pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324. When asked how he had become ruler, Musa explained that the monarch before him refused to believe the ocean surrounding the earth was endless. Driven by curiosity, he prepared 200 ships filled with men and another 200 loaded with gold, water, and provisions meant to last years. The fleet was instructed not to return unless they had found the farthest edge of the sea, or perished in the attempt. Only one vessel ever returned. Its captain described a terrifying encounter. After sailing for a long time, they reached a massive current in the open sea. One by one, ships ahead were swallowed by a whirlpool, vanishing without a trace. Barely escaping, he turned back. Unwilling to accept defeat, Abu Bakr abdicated the throne, leaving it to Musa, and organized an even grander mission. 2,000 ships in total, half carrying men, the other half provisions. Leading this armada himself, he set sail westward into the Atlantic and was never seen again. Though Western scholarship has often dismissed this account, intriguing evidence suggests Columbus may have known of it. On his third voyage, Columbus wrote that part of his purpose was to investigate reports of African traders sailing westward from Guinea, and claims that dark-skinned seafarers have been sighted in the Caribbean, particularly on Hispaniola. The Taino people even recalled visitors arriving from the south and southeast, carrying spears tipped with guanin, a gold, silver, and copper alloy identical to metals crafted in West Africa. It is vital to remember that by 1492, Spain had just concluded the Reconquista, ending centuries of Moorish rule. The Moors, North African Muslims, had profoundly shaped Iberia, introducing advanced knowledge in navigation, astronomy, mathematics, and shipbuilding. Columbus, therefore, did not sail into the unknown blindly. He carried with him tools and insights shaped by African and Arab innovation. Seen in this light, the story of Musa Abu Bakr II is not a forgotten myth but a remarkable and potentially transformative episode in the history of exploration, one that demands recognition, study, and re-evaluation. In the 1400s, deep in West Africa where the Niger River curved like an embracing arm around the land, thrived the Mali Empire, one of the most respected civilizations of its time. Its vast territory stretched across what we now call Mali, Senegal, and Guinea. But back then it was a realm defined by gold, wisdom, and influence. The empire still carried the fragrance of its greatest ruler, Mansa Musa, who had passed in 1337. His name echoed far beyond Africa, whispered in the marketplaces of the Middle East, North Africa, and Europe. He was the man who showered Cairo with gold, whose legendary pilgrimage to Mecca dazzled the world and disrupted economies through sheer generosity. Yet Mali's greatness went beyond its wealth. At its core stood the capital city of Niani, near the Niger's Bend, alive with markets, cultural vibrancy, and a refined system of governance. Judges, ministers, and governors worked hand in hand with the emperor, maintaining one of the most sophisticated administrations in pre-modern Africa. And then, there was Timbuktu, a name that today sounds mythical, almost dreamlike, but in the 1400s, it was a towering beacon of learning. Timbuktu was home to Sankore University, where black African scholars filled libraries with handwritten manuscripts, not borrowed knowledge, but original works. These texts covered medicine, astronomy, mathematics, theology, law, history, and grammar. Students flocked from across the Islamic world to study in Timbuktu and Jen, Mali's twin centers of intellect. Within these halls, philosophy was debated, stars were charted, and medical practices were carefully documented. Lessons unfolded in Arabic, Fulani, Soninke, and other local languages. To be a scholar in Mali was to be revered. Here, books were treasures more valuable than gold. In Mali, knowledge itself was the true currency of power. So the next time someone wonders, did Africa have writing? The answer is Timbuktu. The answer is Sankore. Remind them that long before Gutenberg pressed his first Bible in Europe, black African scholars were already copying, binding, and trading manuscripts across the Sahara. But Mali's greatness was not limited to knowledge alone, it was also an empire of commerce. Salt from the Sahara, gold from bambuks forests, ivory, kola nuts, and fine cloth all flowed through its cities, exchanged with Berber merchants, Egyptian traders, Tunisian caravans, and even Venetian dealers from Europe. By controlling the trans-Saharan trade routes, Mali was not just rich, it was powerful and strategically essential. This was not a people waiting for discovery. This was a civilization shaping its own destiny, proud, brilliant, and influential. And beyond trade or scholarship, Mali's soul was deeply spiritual. Islam thrived at its heart, yet traditional African faiths endured, blending into a society defined by tolerance, fusion, and diversity. The emperor stood as both ruler and moral guide, responsible for his people's welfare in this world and the next. And women, they were not hidden away. Historical records describe women in Mali owning property, shaping politics, commanding respect in markets, and contributing to intellectual life, a striking contrast to the stereotypes often associated with Islamic societies of that age. This was Mali, the empire of kings and scholars, of merchants and builders. A civilization that proved Africa was never cloaked in darkness, but instead radiated as a guiding light. And while Mali flourished in the 1400s, other African kingdoms were also rising to greatness. So let us now journey south, to a land built of stone and pride. Now our journey moves south, beyond the Sahara's endless sands, past the golden savannas, and into the rugged highlands of present-day Zimbabwe. Here, long before a single European set foot on this soil, Africans had already carved their legacy into stone and into eternity. This is the tale of Great Zimbabwe, a civilization so majestic, so enigmatic, that even today its ruins leave archaeologists in awe and stir pride in the hearts of Africans everywhere. By the 1400s, Great Zimbabwe had reached its zenith. A thriving metropolis of nearly 20,000 inhabitants, one of the largest and most influential urban centers in sub-Saharan Africa. Its very name comes from the Shona phrase Zimba Zimbabwe, meaning houses of stone. And this was no poetic flourish. The city was built not of mud or wood, but of massive granite blocks, perfectly aligned without mortar, testament to unmatched precision, geometry, and architectural brilliance. The most iconic of all is the Great Enclosure, an immense circular wall spanning more than 250 meters around, with sections rising over 11 meters high. No European engineer designed it. No foreign hand raised it. This was African genius. This was black brilliance standing eternal in stone. But Great Zimbabwe's story wasn't written in stone alone. It was also a story of trade and power. Positioned between gold-rich lands inland and the bustling ports of the Swahili coast, it became a vital hub in a global exchange network. Through winding rivers and dusty overland trails, traders carried gold, ivory, and cattle eastward, where they were shipped across the seas to Arabia, Persia, India, and even China. Archaeologists unearthing the ruins of Zimbabwe have found Chinese porcelain, Persian glassware, Arab coins, and Indian beads. These artifacts tell a powerful truth, that long before colonial ships crossed the oceans, black African kingdoms were already linked to the world. But Great Zimbabwe wasn't just exporting raw goods, it was shaping them into treasures. Gold was refined into dazzling jewelry, economies were carefully managed, and wealth was woven from both agriculture and trade. So when people claim Africa was cut off from the world, we must ask, if that were true, then how did porcelain from China reach these lands? How did Arab coins find their way into Zimbabwean soil? The truth is clear, Africans were not waiting to join global history. They were already writing it. The rulers of Great Zimbabwe, believed to have come from the Rosvi or Gokarwi lineages, held power not only through governance but also through sacred authority. They were kings and spiritual mediators, guardians of the bond between the human and the divine. Women, too, carried weight in this society, not hidden away, but active as traders, spiritual leaders, and heads of families. And yet, even the greatest cities fall. By the late 1400s and early 1500s, Great Zimbabwe began to fade. Overcrowding, depleted soil, and shifting trade routes slowly dimmed its brilliance. Still, the echoes of its greatness endured, through oral traditions, cultural memory, and the timeless stone walls that still rise defiantly today. When Europeans stumbled upon these ruins centuries later, they refused to believe the obvious truth. They spun tales of Phoenicians, Arabs, even lost tribes of Israel, crediting everyone but the African builders whose descendants still lived nearby. They couldn't accept it because they didn't want to. But we accept it. We know now. Great Zimbabwe was not a forgotten outpost. It was the beating heart of southern innovation, identity, and pride. And as Great Zimbabwe commanded the inland trade, another African story was beginning to stir along the coast, a tale of ships, spices, cities, and the salty breath of the sea. Now we shift east, to the golden edges of Africa where the waves kissed the shores of today's Kenya, Tanzania, Mozambique, and Somalia. Here, in the 1400s, stood the Swahili city-states, a glittering chain of coastal kingdoms whose eyes were fixed on the horizon, reaching out to the world. Cities like Kilwa, Kisiwani, Zanzibar, Mombasa, Malindi, and Sofala may be mere whispers in modern textbooks. Yet in their time they pulsed with life as global crossroads, linking Africa to Arabia, Persia, India, China, and far beyond. Long before European ships prowled these waters, black Africans had already built international ports, magnificent stone cities, and economies that thrived on the sea. These were no small fishing villages. These were world powers. At the heart of it all was Kilwa Kisiwani in present-day Tanzania. By the 1400s, it had become the crown jewel of the coast, commanding trade routes that stretched deep into the African interior. Gold from Great Zimbabwe, ivory from endless forests, and captives taken in wars were funneled through Kilwa's harbors, exchanged for textiles, porcelain, glassware, spices, and incense. The rulers of Kilwa built coral stone palaces, vibrant markets, and towering mosques. Its great mosque, first constructed in the 11th century and later expanded in the 14th, still stands as one of the oldest in all of Africa, living proof of Islam's deep and early roots on the continent. When Portuguese explorers arrived in the late 1400s, they were awestruck, describing Kilwa as among the most breathtaking and refined cities they had ever seen. The Swahili people spoke Swahili, a Bantu tongue enriched with Arabic, and lived in a culture where African, Arab, Persian, and Indian influences blended seamlessly, not through conquest, but through trade, intermarriage, and diplomacy. Yet make no mistake, these were African kingdoms. The rulers, merchants, and communities were black Africans, who welcomed global ideas and practices but never abandoned their own identity. They were builders of empires, architects of trade, and guardians of a legacy carved by their own hands. But the Swahili coast was not defined by Kilwa alone. In Zanzibar, the trade in cloves and spices flourished, filling the air with fragrance that would one day captivate the world. In Mombasa, today part of Kenya, a mighty naval and commercial hub thrived, its harbors bristling with ships and its rulers commanding respect across the seas. Farther north, Malindi opened its gates to emissaries of China's great Admiral Zhang He, whose massive fleets had crossed the Indian Ocean decades before Columbus ever set his eyes on the Atlantic. To the south, Sofala, modern-day Mozambique, served as a gateway for gold flowing from the heart of Africa to distant shores. These city-states shattered every false image of a primitive, pre-colonial Africa. They stood tall with coral stone buildings, bustling cosmopolitan societies, sophisticated courts of law, merchant elites, and diverse populations bound together by African vision and leadership, not foreign domination. Women played vital roles here too: traders, landowners, and matriarchs guiding families and shaping coastal society with wisdom and influence. Yet by the close of the 1400s, a dark shadow began to creep across the horizon. Portuguese ships, bristling with cannons and imperial hunger, entered the Indian Ocean. The harmony of centuries would soon be shaken by conquest, greed, and fire. But before the storm, there was brilliance, a proud coastal civilization of black excellence, carried by ocean winds, woven with trade, culture, and faith. This was Africa, visible, thriving, and standing boldly at the world's crossroads. And even as the waves of empire broke upon the Swahili coast, deep within Central Africa another great kingdom was rising, structured, royal, and powerful. The Kingdom of Congo. Deep within Central Africa, far from the coasts, another kingdom was rising, one destined to rule vast lands, design structured cities, and astonish the first Europeans bold enough to travel inland. This was the Kingdom of Congo. Spread across modern-day northern Angola, Western Democratic Republic of Congo, and parts of the Republic of Congo, it had emerged in the 14th century and by the 1400s was already thriving. At its heart stood the capital, Mbanza, Congo. Not a scatter of huts or wandering clans, but a true city, complete with broad avenues, administrative halls, a royal court, and whole districts serving as embassies for foreign guests. The king, known as the Mana-Congo, was no simple chief. He was a sovereign ruler, commanding a network of provinces, each governed by officials who owed him tribute in goods and soldiers. Around him sat a council of nobles and educated elites, shaping policy and guiding the kingdom's future. The Congo state was far from chaotic. It had laws, taxation systems, meticulous record-keeping, and layered courts of justice where disputes could travel from local chiefs to the king's bench. This was Africa on its own terms, organized, intellectual, and sovereign. Its people lived in carefully arranged villages and towns, with wooden and straw homes set in orderly rows. Their economy thrived on ironworking, weaving, pottery, salt-making, farming, and trade. Congo was not simply surviving, it was innovating, creating, and leading with dignity. Trade routes stretched from the interior to the coast, sending copper, raffia cloth, ivory, and salt into global exchange networks. By the time Europeans arrived in the late 1400s, they did not find a tribal wilderness. They encountered one of the most powerful, sophisticated, and wealthy states in Central Africa. The first encounter came in 1483, when Portuguese navigator Diogo Chao reached the Congo River's mouth, greeted warmly by Congo envoys. Not long after, formal diplomatic ties were forged between Portugal and the Kingdom of Congo, relations of mutual respect, not subjugation. The Mani Congo at that time, Nzinga and Kuwu, even dispatched emissaries to Lisbon and welcomed missionaries. By the early 1500s, his son, Afonso I, embraced Christianity, skillfully weaving European concepts into Congo's governance while safeguarding African sovereignty. Yet beneath the surface, cracks began to form. What started as partnership slowly morphed into exploitation. The Portuguese, lured by Congo's immense wealth, demanded more than trade, they wanted captives. Enslavement, once limited and local, was transformed into a vast, export-driven machine. Even then, Afonso I wrote desperate appeals to the King of Portugal, condemning unlawful slave raids and the moral decay inflicted by foreign greed. The Kingdom of Congo stood as a beacon of African leadership, diplomacy, and statecraft long before colonial rule. For over 300 years, it shaped the politics of both Africa and the Atlantic world. So when people claim Africa had no states, no cities, no political order, remember Mbanza Congo, remember the Mani Congo. Recall the era when Central Africa ruled itself with dignity and strength. And as Congo flourished in the heart of the continent, to the west, another brilliance was rising, a city of walls, bronze artistry, and royal might. The Kingdom of Benin was entering its golden age. Majestic, organized, and dazzling in craftsmanship, the first Europeans who laid eyes on it were struck with disbelief. This was no myth. This was the Kingdom of Benin. Centuries before the term Nigeria existed, Benin had already reached its golden peak in the 15th century, under the reign of the legendary Oba Uwere the Great, around 1440 to 1473. He was not just a monarch but a visionary builder, fearless warrior, and reformer of spiritual life. His legacy was the transformation of Benin City from scattered villages into one of the most advanced, fortified, and artistically celebrated urban centers of its time. Benin City was no mere settlement. It was a structured metropolis with avenues wide enough for 4 horses, monumental earthworks, and sprawling palace compounds. Its defensive system, walls and moats extending over 16,000 kilometers, surpassed even the Great Wall of China, all engineered by African ingenuity. These fortifications were not simple barriers but concentric earthworks built with mastery of soil science, water flow, and communal labor. The city itself was designed in grids, with strict zoning for different classes and purposes. At its heart stood the Oba's royal palace, so vast and sophisticated that Portuguese travelers compared it to Europe's finest capitals. Yet Benin's greatness was not only in power and defense. This was the golden era of artistry, the birth of the iconic Benin bronzes, masterpieces that would astonish the world for centuries. Through the brilliance of lost wax casting, Benin sculptors forged eternal masterpieces. Bronze, brass, and ivory became living memory. Kings, queens, warriors, mothers, leopards, and epic battles captured forever in shimmering form. Every plaque, mask, and statue carried history, spirit, and power. Though the Oba stood as the supreme ruler, his reign was balanced by councils of chiefs, specialized guilds, and spiritual advisors who ensured harmony between governance and sacred order. Religion infused every part of life. Rituals honored ancestors, deities, and nature's forces, linking the kingdom's power to the divine. Far from isolation, Benin cultivated alliances with neighboring African states and cautiously engaged with the Portuguese in the late 1400s, exchanging pepper, ivory, palm oil, and finely crafted goods. To early Europeans, Benin was a revelation. Not a land of savagery, but a sovereign nation. Not chaos, but order. Not emptiness, but artistry. They described a city so clean, disciplined, and refined it shattered every falsehood they had been taught about Africa. Yet centuries later, in 1897, those same outsiders, the British, returned not as guests but as destroyers. With fire and gunpowder, they reduced Benin city to ruins, seizing thousands of bronzes that remain locked away in European museums to this day. But Benin's spirit could not be stolen. Its artistry breathes in memory, its pride endures in blood and stories, and though its walls have fallen, its legacy still towers. As Mali's glory began to fade, a new force rose from its shadow, a black African empire whose vision stretched across deserts and rivers alike. This was the Songhai Empire. By the late 1400s, as Mali's influence weakened, Songhai emerged with its heart in Gao, a thriving city in today's Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. Gao wasn't an ordinary settlement. It was a crossroads of wealth, where salt, gold, kola nuts, horses, and enslaved captives fueled busy markets, while the Niger River served as the empire's lifeline, linking cultures and economies. But Songhai was more than commerce. It was transformation. Its rise began under Sunni Ali, the fierce and brilliant commander who ruled from 1464 to 1492. A strategist of unmatched ambition, he brought fractured lands under one banner, including Timbuktu, which had slipped from Mali's control. Loved by some as a great unifier and feared by others for his suspicion of Muslim scholars, Sunni Ali built a standing army, perfected cavalry warfare, and even deployed naval patrols along the Niger. Through conquest and vision, he carved one of Africa's largest empires, stretching from the Sahara's edge to western Nigeria. Sunni Ali ruled with his own brand of authority, challenging tradition while pushing Songhai toward greatness. After his death in 1492, the same year Columbus crossed the Atlantic, power shifted to Askia Muhammad, who would usher in Songhai's golden age. Under his leadership in the early 1500s, the empire became legendary not only for its might, but for its devotion to scholarship. Timbuktu and Jen once again blazed as centers of learning, where knowledge rivaled wealth as the empire's greatest treasure. From every corner of Africa and even the Middle East, scholars journeyed to Songhai to study law, medicine, philosophy, astronomy, and theology. Lessons were written in Arabic, preserved in thousands of manuscripts, proof that this was not an oral tradition alone but a thriving literate society. Black intellectuals filled libraries, black scientists charted the heavens, and black philosophers debated the nature of justice and knowledge. We were not waiting for Europe to discover us, we were already shaping our own world. Songhai grew beyond Mali's reach, more centralized, more militarily powerful, and truly one of the greatest empires Africa ever produced. Yet, by the late 1500s, Moroccan armies invaded, shattering its might. The empire eventually collapsed, but its memory lived on for generations. Remember this, while Europe staggered toward its renaissance, Africa was already moving forward. We built cities of stone and earth, commanded armies, preserved libraries, and mapped the stars. Songhai reminds us that our story did not begin with chains, but with crowns. The river carries that memory, and so must we. Before the Atlantic, before the scramble, before the colonies, before the chains, there was Africa, and she was magnificent. We have journeyed across centuries and kingdoms, the golden libraries of Timbuktu, the towering stone walls of Great Zimbabwe, the bustling Swahili ports that touched the world, the royal courts of Congo, the artistry of Benin, and the power of Songhai. The truth emerges from beneath centuries of distortion. Africa was not waiting to be civilized. She was civilization. They told us our story began with slavery. But history tells us it began with kingdoms, with astronomers, with architects, with rivers of gold that humbled empires. This was an Africa that built cities with order and vision, governed with laws and councils, traded with India, Persia, and China, studied medicine, astronomy, and law, and created art so stunning the world still marvels today. Most of all, it was an Africa that defined herself, sovereign, proud, and unshackled. We were never a broken people. We were broken open. Our histories scattered like stars across the sky. But the stars still shine. And now, we gather them again. This is not nostalgia. This is reclamation. This is truth. This is the history of Africa.